Thank you for joining me for another Quick Hits conversation. I'm Dr. Robyn. With me today, I have Atif Agha. He is an IT professional doing data analytics, and he is an avid runner based in Chicago. I have Frank Galindo. He has 20 years experience working and volunteering in PR, where he enjoys bringing people together and creating partnership relationships. I have Keji Moses. She is the founder of Maya's Legacy, where they support women and families suffering from pregnancy loss. And I have Simon Coles. He is the CEO of Amphora Research Systems, where they free scientists from the tyranny of paper. And he is also the founder of Better Conversations. The question that I have for you all today, what does it mean to fairly compensate someone? Frank, give us your thoughts first.
So what it means to fairly compensate someone, right? I guess that's the word that kind of puts into perspective. The first thing that comes to mind, fairly is relative. And so it all depends what industry you're in and what does the landscape look like. If you're compensating employees, what are other employers compensating their employees for the same work? And that takes into account your education, your experience, and your personality, right? It's not just about the skills you have, but how do you fit in and contribute and add value to your teammates? So, right, all those multiple factors. But again, fairly to me, bare bones has to come down to, well, you want to make sure that your compensation is in line with what other folks with the same types of backgrounds and skills that I mentioned before are getting compensated, so that nobody's getting shortchanged, regardless of gender or any of those other qualifications that sometimes people use to make sure that we're justly compensating folks just for their experience and education.
Okay.
I'm just going to add to that. I completely agree with you, Frank. It's a very subjective term, right? Fairly is a subjective term. But at the same time, I think I'm just not going to go into what other standards are depending on which pay frame you are into and what you should be compensated. I think it comes down to, does what you expect to be paid, is employer paying you that? If that's happening, you're happy, employer's happy, and then you've got a good path going forward. Otherwise, if you are in a feeling that, well, I deserve more and my employer is not paying me, you're just never going to be in a good spot. That's why people in the same job doing the same thing sometimes have different salaries, just because other people may have taken risks. How do you decide the fairness in that? You can't, right? Employers have to make best decision for how to maximize their profits and to still make sure their employees are retained, they don't leave, they are happy. I think that's how I define the fairness in salary or in compensation.
Okay.
I think that firstly, it's compensation, not just pay. There can be other benefits like healthcare or whatever, but there can also be non-monetary compensation, as it were. It might be that you're being trained up, you're getting some additional skills, you're on an apprenticeship, you have flexible working or something like that. I think it's wrong to just look at money, as it were. And I think in terms of the fairness, as everyone says, it's kind of a bit tricky because also you don't really know what the market rate is. And it's even more complicated these days where you might be hiring someone who's in a different geography from you, where the pay scales might be different. And I think that's where it certainly needs to be a very transparent process, and you've kind of agreed you're going to get paid that much. Both sides have agreed. And I think it's also, whilst, we have a culture in some days, an obligation to keep pay private, I think if people found out what each other's were paid, they shouldn't be shocked or surprised. I think as an employer, if you're sitting there looking at everybody, you owe it to yourself and everybody else to make sure that people are broadly in line and you can discuss any differences there might be.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also important to know what value you're bringing to the table. So if you feel like you're bringing a level of value into the organization, then you can negotiate what you deserve to be paid, because your salary is not a participation price. They can't pay you just for turning up at work. You have to bring something to the table. You have to show that you're an asset to the organization. So I think there's many different factors that contribute to what fairness means to you personally, and then you can determine whether or not you're being fairly compensated.
I suspect everyone will have different opinions about the value they bring and the fairness of their compensation. I think it's one of those really interesting.
So negotiation has two parts to it. One is really how much you bring value, if you can measure it to a certain extent, and how much someone else is willing to pay you for the same amount of work, right? If there's nobody else willing to pay you, then you're getting fairly compensated for whatever you're bringing to the table. It's hard
don't bring me a rival job offer. If you go, I can get £5,000 more if I go to this other company. It's great. See you later.
Exactly. No, but to the point, how do I know when I'm fairly compensated? This is how I know. Is someone else willing to pay me? Can I find a job with the same salary, the same compensation? That's how I think you look at it.
But it's not a commodity market. So that kind of comparison is actually really hard to make. And it's really hard to say, look at an individual and go, you're bringing this value. It's really the sales guys who are the ones who have the hardest numbers, and they will tend to get very variable, commission-based pay schemes because of that. But an R&D engineer, that's hard.
Simon, you got to come down to our level at the paid employee level, and then.
No, I love that he has a different perspective, because I think about when I was working in corporate, and it was hard for them to fairly compensate me because I was doing the job of 3 people. I didn't have any education, so they couldn't base it on that. When I first started, I didn't really have a whole lot of background. All they could say was, well, you do this job. And I was like, but I do this job and that job too. And so I never felt like I was fairly compensated because I was doing way more work. I was working above my pay grade.
It sounds to me like the definition of fairly then really comes from the employee versus the employer more so, because you have to understand as best you can. So what does the market look like as far as compensation for your role? And then what do you feel your intrinsic value is that you bring to the organization apart from your skills? The different pieces I'm hearing from the 4 of you, it's almost as though, right, the employee needs to make their own assessment of what they feel for themselves is fair, right? And then that's where the negotiation comes in, what you guys mentioned.
It's a grown-up thing. And I think the people who can have that grown-up discussion, frankly, deserve to be paid more than the people who can't.
And that's why I never did, because I wasn't brave enough to go and say, look, either you pay me or I'll go somewhere else that will. I would fuss about it, but I rarely took the leap to say, okay, fine, I'll leave.
The way I look at it, if you're bringing a rival offer, you've already passed the point of getting a better salary. Companies are actually coming on what is for a certain role, what is the market standard? And they're bringing those bands in the picture and saying, this is the standard from X amount to Y amount.
I've seen situations where, you work for a government organization and they have policies and procedures and things like that. So you're band E, let's say, for instance, and everybody else you're working with is a band E, but you're lumbered with most of the work. Okay, but everybody else is being paid the same amount of money. And so how does an organization like that, how do you then tell them, okay, this is my contract, but I feel like I am doing more than everybody else and I should be paid more than that? It's a complicated one, I believe. It depends on the organizations you're working with. Some organizations are driven by targets. So if you meet the target, then, you're fairly compensated in terms of wages or other benefits that comes with that. But then when you work within an institution where everything is set in a particular way, it's harder to define what is fair and not.
Those institutions have trouble keeping staff. I've got a family member who works in the civil service as a programmer, and they've got pay bands which are completely out of whack with the market rate. Yeah.
And a question we don't really have time to answer, but I think as part of this is who's responsible for making it fair. I know for me, when I employ people, if they come to me and the hourly rate or whatever number they give me, I feel like is lower than what their value is, I'll say, you know what, we can do better than that. Is that everybody's responsibility as an employer to do that? I think so, but you're not going to see big corporations do it.
Right. It's a negotiation for sure, right? It is an understanding. And again, depends on the employer as well. If it's a large organization, it's very hard to negotiate. It's a smaller organization where you can actually show a value and they see that value in terms of dollars and returns. They may be able to more flexible and accommodate.
Does that mean if I should compensate you more because you're more valuable, if you get less valuable, can I drop your salary?
Yes.
Can't in UK?
That happens all the time.
Well, no, UK, that's not a thing.
Mountains of HR paperwork and stuff like that, but it'd be a really very difficult situation.
Oh, interesting. Well, that is our 10 minutes. So we're going to have to leave that conversation on the table. Thank you so much for having with me. And I look forward to speaking to each of you again really soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.